On June 6, 1944, the world witnessed one of the most daring and decisive military operations in history, the D-Day invasion, also known as the Normandy Landings. It was the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted, and it marked the turning point in World War II. More than 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of France to break Nazi Germany's hold on Western Europe. The operation was not just a battle. It was a symbol of courage, unity, and sacrifice. Soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and many other Allied nations came together under one mission: to liberate Europe from tyranny. The landings were anything but easy. Facing heavily fortified defenses, machine gun fire, artillery, and treacherous terrain, the men of D-Day fought against impossible odds. Omaha Beach, in particular, became a site of unimaginable bravery, where countless lives were lost, but where determination refused to be broken. Behind the scenes, Operation Overlord was a masterpiece of planning and deception. From the paratroopers who landed under the cover of night, to the naval bombardments and the ingenious use of fake armies, the Allies used strategy as much as sheer strength. D-Day was costly. Thousands of lives were lost in just one day. But their sacrifice paved the way for the liberation of France, the collapse of Nazi control in Europe, and ultimately, the end of World War II less than a year later. Today, we remember D-Day not only as a military victory, but as a moment that defined freedom. It reminds us that courage can overcome oppression, unity can defeat tyranny, and sacrifice can shape the course of history. When we talk about the history of the Second World War, few dates stand out as powerfully as June 6, 1944. This single day, forever remembered as D-Day, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in Europe. While to many it is simply a date, the significance goes far beyond the calendar. It was a culmination of years of planning, sacrifice, and anticipation. The operation itself was officially given the code name Operation Overlord, a title that reflected the sheer scale, ambition, and dominance that the Allies hoped to achieve. The idea for such a massive invasion had been circulating long before 1944. As early as 1942, the Allied leaders, particularly Winston Churchill of Britain and Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, knew that defeating Nazi Germany would eventually require a direct assault on mainland Europe. The Soviet Union, under constant attack on the Eastern Front, was also pressuring the Allies to open a second front to relieve some of the German military pressure in the East. For months, Joseph Stalin demanded a large-scale invasion in Western Europe, and while earlier attempts like the Dieppe raid in 1942 ended in disaster, they taught valuable lessons that shaped what would later become Operation Overlord. The selection of June 6, 1944, was not random. The planners had to consider a vast range of factors: tides, moonlight, weather conditions, and the element of surprise. The assault had to happen during a full moon to assist paratrooper landings at night, and the tide had to be low enough to expose German obstacles, but high enough for landing craft to get close to shore. Originally, the invasion was scheduled for June 5th, but bad weather forced General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces, to postpone by one day. Had the weather not improved, the invasion might have been delayed by weeks, giving the Germans more time to strengthen their defenses. That narrow window of opportunity makes June 6 a date of both historical necessity and fate. As for the code name itself, Operation Overlord, it carried symbolic weight. Military code names are often chosen for secrecy and neutrality, but Overlord suggested dominance, control, and authority. It represented the vision of Allied command. This would not be just another battle, but the decisive strike that would re-establish control over Western Europe. Within Overlord was also the sub-operation Operation Neptune, the naval phase that covered the actual beach landings. Together, these names reflected the layered complexity of the invasion, from planning to execution. In the months leading up to June 6, meticulous preparation defined Operation Overlord. The Allies amassed an enormous force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen were mobilized across Britain. Equipment, landing craft, and supplies were stockpiled in secrecy. Roads, ports, and railways in southern England became staging grounds for one of the most ambitious assaults in history. Even civilians in Britain noticed the buildup of troops and machinery. Yet the exact time and location of the invasion remained a closely guarded secret. Part of maintaining the secrecy was the careful use of deception. Code names and false signals were employed to disguise the real intent of Operation Overlord. The Germans were led to believe that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the closest point between Britain and France, rather than the beaches of Normandy. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, and decoy radio transmissions all played a role in ensuring that when June 6 arrived, German defenses were misaligned. When dawn broke on that fateful day, Operation Overlord officially began. Before the amphibious landings, paratroopers from the United States and Britain dropped behind enemy lines after midnight, cutting communications, destroying bridges, and securing key positions to disrupt German reinforcements. Hours later, the naval bombardments opened fire, and the landing craft surged toward the beaches. The world was witnessing the launch of the greatest amphibious assault in human history. June 6 was more than just a starting point. It symbolized Allied determination. The selection of the date carried a sense of urgency. The war had dragged on for nearly 5 years, and Nazi Germany remained a formidable enemy. Every day of delay meant more lives lost across Europe, more suffering under Nazi occupation, and more time for Germany to fortify its Atlantic defenses. Eisenhower himself understood the gravity of the moment. He even wrote a note accepting personal responsibility in case the invasion failed. That handwritten statement, prepared on the eve of June 6th, reminds us of the immense pressure riding on a single date. The title D-Day also deserves special mention. Contrary to popular belief, the D in D-Day does not stand for doom, decision, or deliverance, though many have attached such symbolic meanings to it over the years. In military terms, D-Day was simply shorthand for Day of the Operation, used to maintain secrecy and flexibility in planning. The invasion of Normandy became so legendary that D-Day is now almost exclusively associated with June 6, 1944. Another layer of importance lies in the timing of Operation Overlord within the broader war. By mid-1944, the Allies had already achieved victories in North Africa and Italy, but Western Europe remained under Nazi control. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the war, and its people were suffering catastrophic losses. The timing of June 6 allowed for coordination with Soviet advances on the Eastern Front, effectively squeezing Nazi Germany between two powerful armies. The date was not just strategic. It was political, a promise fulfilled to Stalin that the West would finally strike hard against Hitler's fortress Europe. In Britain, the night of June 5th leading into June 6th was filled with anticipation. Soldiers wrote last letters to their families. Priests offered blessings, and commanders gave final briefings. For many of the young men boarding landing craft, June 6 would be their last day alive. They were ordinary people, farmers, clerks, teachers, and factory workers, now thrust into extraordinary circumstances. This human element gave the date its immortal weight. It was not just a mark on the calendar, but the moment when thousands of individuals stepped into history. The code name Overlord also reflected the vast scale of command required. Eisenhower oversaw not just American forces, but a coalition of nations, each bringing its own units, commanders, and equipment. Coordinating British, Canadian, American, Free French, and other Allied contingents was a task of immense complexity. The name, Overlord, thus captured the unity of nations under one supreme command structure, a rare achievement in military history. In retrospect, June 6, 1944, is remembered as a date when the tide of war turned decisively. It was not the end of the conflict. Fierce battles still lay ahead, but it was the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The code name Operation Overlord has since become synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and monumental strategy. When historians describe the Normandy Landings of June 6, 1944, one phrase consistently emerges: the largest seaborne invasion in history. The sheer magnitude of Operation Overlord defies comparison. In terms of men, machines, ships, and aircraft, nothing before or since has matched the scale of that moment. To grasp the enormity of what unfolded, one must imagine a vast armada stretching across the horizon, the sky filled with aircraft, and the sea churning with thousands of landing craft carrying soldiers toward the shores of France. The invasion force consisted of over 156,000 Allied troops who landed on the beaches of Normandy. These men represented not only the United States, Britain, and Canada, but also Free French forces, Poles, Australians, Norwegians, and soldiers from other occupied nations who fought alongside the Allies. The very size of this coalition was historic. It wasn't just one nation storming a shore, but a collection of free peoples determined to liberate Europe. Each soldier was a piece of a massive human mosaic, united by a single mission. Supporting them was an armada of approximately 7,000 ships and landing vessels of every shape and size. This naval force was itself the largest fleet ever assembled. It included massive battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that pounded German defenses with heavy artillery. It also included minesweepers clearing paths through dangerous waters, troop transports carrying men across the English Channel, and specialized landing craft designed to unload tanks, vehicles, and supplies directly onto the beaches. Every type of vessel imaginable took part, from converted merchant ships to innovative craft like the Higgins boats that carried small groups of soldiers right onto the sand. Above the invasion fleet roared a sky dominated by Allied air power. On D-Day, more than 11,000 aircraft flew in support of the operation. These included heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Lancaster, which targeted German fortifications and railways. Medium bombers and fighter bombers flew ahead to strafe enemy positions and cut off reinforcements. Fighters such as the Spitfire, P-51 Mustang, and Typhoon patrolled the skies, ensuring German aircraft could not interfere. Transport planes carried thousands of paratroopers, dropping them into the dark French countryside in the early hours of June 6. The sheer number of aircraft ensured that, for the first time in the war, the Allies had absolute dominance of the skies over France. The numbers themselves are staggering. To move 156,000 troops across the English Channel required not only ships, but also an extraordinary supply chain. Alongside the soldiers, thousands of vehicles, tanks, jeeps, trucks, artillery pieces, had to be loaded and ferried across. Supplies such as food, fuel, ammunition, and medical equipment had to be prepositioned in immense quantities. The Allies understood that landing on the beaches was only the beginning. Sustaining the invasion meant ensuring that the logistical pipeline did not break. Thus, ships carried not only fighting men, but also the materials of war, forming a lifeline from Britain to France. What makes the scale even more remarkable is the level of coordination required. This was not a single army moving in unison, but a multinational force with different languages, strategies, and equipment. British and Canadian troops were assigned to Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, while American forces landed at Utah and Omaha. Free French units fought alongside the Allies, while resistance groups within France coordinated sabotage to disrupt German reinforcements. Naval and air units worked in tandem, timing their bombardments to clear the way for troops without destroying them in the process. This level of synchronization across land, sea, and air was unprecedented in military history. The logistical preparations alone reveal the true meaning of largest invasion. In southern England, countless camps, airfields, and ports were transformed into staging areas. Thousands of ships were gathered, each with a specific role and timetable. Soldiers rehearsed landings for months, practicing on mock beaches built in Britain to resemble Normandy's terrain. Roads were congested with convoys moving men and equipment, while secrecy was enforced to prevent German intelligence from learning the invasion scale. Operation Overlord was as much about moving mountains of supplies as it was about military strategy. When dawn broke on June 6, the enormity of the invasion was visible even to those on shore. German soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall described the sea as a floating city of ships stretching as far as the eye could see. The thunder of naval guns echoed across the coastline, while the hum of aircraft engines filled the air. For the defenders, the sight was overwhelming. For the attackers, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The Allies had managed to concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, a feat that demonstrated their industrial, logistical, and military superiority. The role of the aircraft cannot be overstated. More than 2,000 bombers struck German positions before the landings began, though many of the bombs missed due to cloud cover. Still, the presence of Allied air power prevented German reinforcements from moving freely. Bridges, railways, and roads had been systematically destroyed in the weeks leading up to D-Day, isolating German divisions. Paratroopers, carried by more than 800 transport planes, added to the chaos by landing behind enemy lines. cutting communications, and seizing key crossroads. Without air superiority, the invasion would have been impossible. At sea, the naval bombardment unleashed unprecedented firepower. Battleships like HMS Warspite, USS Texas, and others shelled German bunkers and artillery positions with massive 14 and 15-inch guns. Though not all defenses were destroyed, the bombardment provided crucial support for the first wave of soldiers waiting ashore. Destroyers, some risking grounding themselves in shallow waters, closed in a fire directly at German strongpoints. Minesweepers cleared channels to prevent catastrophe, while landing craft darted back and forth, braving rough seas and enemy fire to deliver wave after wave of troops. The human element of this largest invasion is equally critical. Imagine being one of those 156,000 men, packed shoulder to shoulder in a landing craft, seasick from the rough channel crossing, weighed down with equipment, and facing the unknown. Each soldier carried about 70 pounds of gear, including rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations, and sometimes even flamethrowers or demolition charges. They knew that the fate of the war might depend on their actions in the next few hours. For many, the sight of thousands of ships and aircraft gave courage. For others, it underscored the enormity of the task ahead. The invasion size was not limited to a single day. In the weeks that followed D-Day, the flow of men and equipment across the Channel turned Normandy into a vast Allied beachhead. By the end of June, more than 1 million Allied soldiers had landed in France, supported by hundreds of thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies. To maintain this momentum, the Allies built artificial harbors, known as mulberry harbors, to unload ships directly onto the beaches. They also laid pipelines under the Channel, codenamed Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, to supply fuel. These innovations highlight how large this invasion was more than a one-day event. It was a massive, ongoing operation that reshaped the course of the war. The numbers, 156,000 troops, 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, are more than statistics. They represent the scale of human effort required to challenge the most fortified coastline in the world. They reveal the industrial might of the Allied nations, the careful planning of their commanders, and the bravery of ordinary soldiers. No invasion before or since has matched the scale of what occurred on that day in June 1944. The Normandy Landings on June 6, 1944, were not the achievement of one nation alone. They were the collective effort of a coalition of countries bound together by shared sacrifice and a common mission: to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. Operation Overlord brought together an unprecedented alliance of nations, each contributing men, resources, and expertise to the largest seaborne invasion in history. What made D-Day extraordinary was not only its scale, but also the unity of so many diverse nations working side by side under one command structure. At the forefront were the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, the three main pillars of the invasion force. Yet the operation also involved contributions from the Free French, Polish, Australian, New Zealand, Norwegian, Belgian, Czechoslovak, Dutch, and Greek forces. Each played a role, some large, some smaller, but all were significant in showing that the struggle against Nazi Germany was a global fight. The United States. The United States provided the largest single contingent of forces on D-Day. More than 73,000 American troops landed on June 6th, split between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. At Omaha, U.S. soldiers endured horrific losses, facing well-entrenched German defenders. At Utah, the landings were comparatively less costly, though still dangerous. American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions parachuted behind German lines hours before dawn, securing bridges, crossroads, and key positions to prevent counterattacks. The U.S. also provided an enormous portion of the naval fleet and air support. Thousands of aircraft, including bombers, fighter, and transport planes, were American-built and flown by U.S. crews. America's industrial power ensured that the invasion had the necessary landing craft, vehicles, and equipment to succeed. The American role was not just numerical but also symbolic. Their entry into the war had tipped the balance against Nazi Germany, and D-Day demonstrated the full might of American military power on the world stage. The United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was both the base of operations and one of the leading forces in the invasion. Britain had been at war with Germany since 1939, and by 1944, its military experience was vast. On D-Day, about 61,000 British troops landed, primarily on Gold Beach and Sword Beach. British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division made daring landings east of the invasion beaches, capturing bridges across the River Orne and silencing German artillery at Merville Battery. The Royal Navy played a central role, contributing the bulk of the invasion fleet, from battleships to landing craft. The Royal Air Force also provided thousands of aircraft that bombed German defenses and ensured air superiority. As the host nation, Britain also served as a staging ground where troops from across the world gathered, trained, and prepared for the assault. Every village, port, and airfield in southern England was transformed into a hub of military activity in the months leading up to June 1944. Canada's contribution to D-Day was enormous relative to its population. More than 14,000 Canadian soldiers landed at Juno Beach, supported by the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force. Juno was heavily defended, and Canadian troops faced obstacles ranging from seawalls to machine gun nests. Casualties were high in the opening hours, but Canadian forces pushed inland farther than any other unit on D-Day. The Royal Canadian Navy provided more than 100 ships, including destroyers and landing craft, while the Royal Canadian Air Force flew bombing and escort missions. Canada's role was significant because it showcased the determination of a smaller nation, far from Europe, to commit itself fully to the liberation of the continent. Free France. Though France had fallen to Germany in 1940, the Free French forces under General Charles de Gaulle played an important symbolic and practical role. French commandos joined the British in storming Sword Beach, fighting to liberate their homeland. French naval vessels also took part in the invasion, and Free French air squadrons flew missions during the operation. Equally important was the work of the French resistance. In the days and hours leading up to D-Day, resistance fighters carried out acts of sabotage, cutting telephone lines, destroying railway tracks, and ambushing German patrols. Their actions disrupted German communications and reinforcements, giving the Allies an advantage. For the French, D-Day was not just a military campaign. It was the beginning of reclaiming their sovereignty. Poland, though occupied since 1939, contributed brave forces to D-Day through its government in exile and armed forces that had regrouped in Britain. Polish naval ships participated in the Armada, providing escort and bombardment support. Polish fighter squadrons, which had already gained fame during the Battle of Britain, flew sorties over Normandy, protecting Allied bombers and attacking ground targets. Though the Polish ground forces did not land on June 6 itself, they later joined the battle in Normandy and fought with distinction. Their presence was a reminder that many nations occupied by Nazi Germany still fought on through exile armies. Australia and New Zealand. Both Australia and New Zealand, members of the British Commonwealth, contributed personnel, particularly in the naval and air forces. Australian sailors served on Royal Navy ships, and Royal Australian Air Force squadrons flew missions over Normandy. New Zealand airmen likewise flew in RAF units, providing bomber crews and fighter pilots. Though their ground forces were primarily engaged in other theaters, such as the Pacific and Italy, their presence at D-Day demonstrated the global reach of the Allied coalition. Norway, occupied since 1940, also took part through its exiled navy and merchant fleet. Norwegian ships helped escort the invasion convoys across the channel. The Norwegian resistance, though less directly tied to D-Day, also played a vital role in the larger Allied campaign by providing intelligence and sabotaging German supply routes in occupied Europe. Their participation symbolized how smaller nations under occupation continue to fight alongside the Allies in every way possible. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia. Exiled forces from Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia contributed troops, airmen, and naval units. Belgian commandos trained with British forces and later fought in Normandy. Dutch naval vessels joined the Armada, while Dutch pilots flew in RAF squadrons. Czechoslovak airmen, already renowned for their service in Britain, took part in aerial missions during the invasion. Each of these contributions, though smaller in number, underscored the collective determination of occupied nations to regain their independence. Greece. Greek naval vessels and sailors also joined the invasion fleet, escorting convoys and supporting the landings. Greece, like many other occupied nations, had governments in exile and forces fighting alongside the Allies in various theaters. Their participation at Normandy reflected the global nature of the struggle, with even nations far from France determined to play their part. The Normandy invasion of June 6, 1944, was centered on 5 carefully selected landing zones along the northern coast of France. Each was given a code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. These names will become etched into history, each representing not only a physical stretch of sand, but also stories of sacrifice, heroism, and strategy. The beaches were not chosen randomly. They were the product of intense study by Allied planners who considered tide patterns, beach gradients, access to inland roads, and the presence of German defenses. Together, these 5 landing zones formed the spearhead of Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. Utah Beach. Utah Beach lay on the westernmost edge of the invasion zone, and it was assigned to the American forces, primarily the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. The mission at Utah was to establish a foothold on the Cotentin Peninsula, with the ultimate goal of capturing the vital port city of Cherbourg. What made Utah significant was not just its beach, but its access to roads leading inland, which would be crucial for securing supplies and reinforcements. On the morning of June 6, strong currents and navigational errors caused many American landing craft to drift nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing area. What could have been disastrous turned out to be fortunate. The new landing zone was less heavily defended than the planned sector. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who went ashore with the first wave despite his arthritis and heart problems, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership helped calm nervous troops and adapt to the unexpected circumstances. At Utah, the Americans faced less resistance compared to Omaha. German defenses were still dangerous, with machine guns, artillery, and mines, but casualties were far lighter than anticipated. About 200 men killed, wounded, or missing out of 23,000 who landed. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already landed inland during the night, securing bridges and crossroads to block German reinforcements. By the end of D-Day, Utah Beach was firmly under American control, serving as a key stepping stone for the larger campaign in Normandy. Omaha Beach. If Utah was unexpectedly less bloody, Omaha Beach became the deadliest of all the landing zones. Omaha stretched 4 miles between steep bluffs, defended by some of the most heavily fortified German positions in Normandy. The beach was assigned to the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, supported by Rangers tasked with capturing nearby cliffs at Point du Hoc. The Americans approaching Omaha faced obstacles at every step. The Germans, mainly from the 352nd Infantry Division, had transformed the coastline into a killing ground. Machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, artillery, and anti-tank obstacles lined the shore. The water was littered with mines and steel hedgehogs designed to tear apart landing craft. When the first waves of soldiers came ashore, many were cut down by relentless gunfire. The landing craft themselves became death traps. Seasickness, confusion, and panic added to the chaos. Many soldiers drowned under the weight of their gear before even reaching dry land. Tanks and amphibious vehicles, intended to provide fire support, often sank in the rough surf. By mid-morning, Omaha was on the verge of disaster. Casualties mounted into the thousands. Entire companies were wiped out before they could move forward. And yet, through sheer determination, small groups of survivors began scaling the bluffs, destroying enemy positions one by one. Rangers at Point du Hoc scaled cliffs under fire to eliminate German artillery that threatened the invasion fleet. Omaha Beach cost the Americans over 2,000 casualties on D-Day, but by the end of the day, the beachhead was secure. The battle for Omaha became a symbol of sacrifice and grit, remembered as one of the bloodiest and most heroic episodes of the war. Gold Beach. Moving eastward, Gold Beach was assigned to the British 50th Infantry Division. The objective at Gold was to secure a beachhead, capture the town of Bayou, and link up with American forces landing at Omaha to the west and Canadian forces at Juno to the east. Gold was strategically important because it offered access to roads leading inland and was near Arromanches, the future site of one of the artificial mulberry harbors the Allies would build to unload supplies. Gold Beach presented its own challenges. The Germans had fortified the coastal towns with machine guns, artillery, and strong points. The beach was also obstructed with underwater mines and steel obstacles. Heavy seas caused delays for British tanks, reducing the armor support for the infantry in the first wave. Despite this, the British advanced steadily. One notable success was the use of specialized armored vehicles nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, developed by Major General Percy Hobart. These included tanks with flails to clear mines, tanks with ramps to cross obstacles, and flamethrower tanks to eliminate bunkers. These innovations gave the British a critical advantage at Gold. By the evening of June 6, the British had secured the beach and pushed several miles inland, though they fell short of capturing Bayou on the first day. Gold Beach was also the location where Winston Churchill's son, Randolph Churchill, came ashore as a war correspondent, symbolizing Britain's personal connection to the invasion. Juno Beach, in the center of the invasion front, was assigned to the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. Their objectives included capturing the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer, advancing inland to link up with British forces at Golden Sword, and pushing toward a vital crossroad city. The Canadians faced some of the toughest defenses of the day. The Germans had fortified the beach with concrete bunkers, artillery, and barbed wire. The landing was delayed due to rough seas, which meant that German defenses were not fully destroyed by naval and air bombardment. When the first wave of Canadians landed, they faced withering fire. Casualties were high, particularly among those in the very first wave. Despite these challenges, the Canadians showed remarkable determination. They fought house to house in coastal villages, clearing out stubborn German defenders. By midday, they had broken to the coastal defenses and advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day, nearly 6 miles. Their success at Juno demonstrated not only Canada's military strength, but also its willingness to bear heavy sacrifices in a war fought far from home. More than 1,000 Canadians became casualties at Juno Beach on June 6, with about 340 killed. When people imagine the D-Day invasion, their minds often go to the daylight landings on the beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. But before the sun rose on June 6, 1944, before the first assault craft touched the shore, another battle had already begun in the darkness above France. This was the mission of the paratroopers, those elite soldiers who jumped from the sky under the cover of night. Their task was not glamorous, nor was it simple. It was dangerous, chaotic, and uncertain. Yet, without their sacrifice, the entire operation could have faltered before it even began. At the heart of the airborne assault were 2 American divisions, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, alongside the British 6th Airborne Division. In total, about 24,000 paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines during the night of June 5th into June 6th. Their objectives were critical: seize vital bridges, disrupt German communications, cut off reinforcements, and create confusion in the German ranks. The beaches were fortified and deadly, but the paratroopers were tasked with ensuring that when the soldiers hit the sand, they would not immediately be overrun by German counterattacks coming from the interior. The night itself was filled with tension. As the paratroopers boarded their C-47 transport planes, the atmosphere was electric. Some men were quiet, lost in thought, clutching letters to loved ones. Others tried to mask their fear with humor, singing songs or joking with their comrades. But everyone knew the risks. Jumping into enemy territory at night, weighed down with gear, landing in fields riddled with hedgerows, rivers, and mines. It was as close to a gamble with fate as any soldier could take. At around 10 p.m. on June 5th, the first planes lifted off from England. The sky above the channel was filled with the rumble of engines, the glow of navigation lights, and the nervous silence of soldiers waiting for the order to jump. The weather was far from ideal. Cloud cover, poor visibility, and strong winds plagued the flight paths. German anti-aircraft fire soon added to the chaos, forcing pilots to take evasive maneuvers. The result was that many paratroopers were scattered far from their designated drop zones. Entire units found themselves broken apart, with small groups of men lost in the dark countryside, try to regroup under constant threat of German patrols. The chaos, however, became an unexpected advantage. German defenders, confused by the widespread landings, struggled to understand the scope of the invasion. They could not tell if a large army had been dropped behind their lines or if the paratroopers were isolated groups. This confusion slowed their response, buying valuable time for the beach landings at dawn. Among the most famous missions of the night was the capture of bridges over the Murderette River and the securing of causeways leading off Utah Beach. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, fought desperately to seize key road junctions near Corentin, preventing German reinforcements from driving straight into the beachheads. Meanwhile, the 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division, faced brutal resistance around Saint-Mère-Église, one of the first towns to be liberated in France. In a twist of fate, paratroopers accidentally landed directly in the town square where German troops were stationed. A fierce firefight broke out, and the Church of Saint-Mère-Église became an enduring symbol of D-Day when paratrooper John Steele famously got his parachute caught on the church steeple, dangling helplessly for hours while the battle raged below. The British 6th Airborne Division had their own high-risk assignments. They were tasked with capturing and holding the Pegasus Bridge over King Canal and the nearby Orne River Bridge, preventing German armor from sweeping across and threatening the eastern flank of the invasion. In one of the most daring assaults of the entire war, British glider troops landed just yards from the bridges in the dead of night. Crashing through fields at high speed, they stunned the German defenders and secured the bridges within minutes. Their success ensured that reinforcements from the east would be delayed, and that the Allied left flank remained protected. But not all missions went as planned. Many paratroopers drowned when they landed in flooded fields deliberately prepared by the Germans. Weighted down with equipment, some men never resurfaced. Others landed far from their units, fighting alone or in small band for hours or even days until they could rejoin the larger Allied forces pushing inland from the beaches. The night was filled with confusion, gunfire in the distance, shadowy figures moving to the hedgerows, flares illuminating the sky, and the constant fear of running into an enemy patrol. Despite the disarray, the spirit of the airborne soldiers carried them forward. Improvisation became their weapon. Even without radios, maps, or commanders, small groups of paratroopers carried out ambushes, sabotaged roads, and attacked German convoys. Their ability to adapt under pressure reflected the rigorous training they had endured in the months leading up to the invasion. These soldiers had been prepared to think independently, to act without waiting for orders, and to seize every opportunity to cause disruption. The contribution of the paratroopers cannot be measured solely in territory gained or bridges captured. Their very presence behind enemy lines created fear and hesitation in the German command. Field Marshal Rommel, tasked with defending the French coast, was caught off guard by the scope and scale of the airborne assault. The paratroopers forced the Germans to spread their forces thin, delaying the decisive counterattacks that could have driven the Allies back into the sea. The cost, however, was heavy. Thousands of airborne troops were killed, wounded, or captured during the first 24 hours. For many, the Normandy hedgerows became their final resting place. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. By sunrise on June 6th, when the first assault wave stormed the beaches, the paratroopers had already shaped the battlefield, turning what could have been a disastrous landing into a foothold for liberation. When the Allies planned the liberation of Western Europe, one of their greatest concerns was not only the sheer number of German troops defending the continent, but also the colossal system of fortifications guarding the coastline of France. This network of defenses, stretching from the shores of Norway down to the border of Spain, came to be known as the Atlantic Wall. For Adolf Hitler, it was a protective shield that would keep Europe under Nazi control. For the Allies, it was the obstacle that had to be overcome before any invasion could succeed. The concept of the Atlantic Wall was ambitious. An unbroken chain of bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, and minefields designed to repel any amphibious assault. Its construction began in 1942 after Hitler grew convinced that the Allies would eventually attempt a cross-channel invasion. The fall of North Africa and the Allied advances in Italy only strengthened his belief that an invasion of France was inevitable. Hitler ordered the Organisation Todt, a massive German engineering group, to oversee construction employing forced laborers, prisoners of war, and local civilians under harsh conditions to build the defenses. By 1944, when the Allies prepared for D-Day, the Atlantic Wall had become a formidable reality. Along the coast of Normandy, German engineers and soldiers had erected thousands of defensive structures. These included massive concrete bunkers that housed heavy artillery, designed to fire on ships approaching the beaches. Machine gun nests were carefully positioned with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any landing troops would face a storm of bullets. Mortar pits, anti-tank obstacles, and trenches formed layers of resistance meant to grind down the attackers before they could gain a foothold. Perhaps the most iconic elements of the Atlantic Wall were the dragon's teeth and, check, hedgehogs. These were steel and concrete obstacles planted across the beaches to stop tanks and landing craft. Mines were buried in the sand and placed on wooden poles, ready to explode under the weight of vehicles or even the boots of soldiers. Offshore, stakes and obstacles were set up to rip open the hulls of landing boats at high tide. In every direction, danger awaited the invaders. Behind these physical defenses were the troops of the German Wehrmacht. By June 1944, the German command had stationed divisions along the French coastline, though their quality varied. Some units were composed of seasoned veterans, while others included conscripts from occupied nations who had little motivation to fight. Still, the defenders had the advantage of strong positions and months of preparation. The beaches of Normandy, in particular, were considered unlikely sites for invasion, which allowed the Germans to fortify them with deadly precision. At the head of the German defensive effort stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox of North Africa. In late 1943, Hitler personally assigned Rommel to inspect and improve the defenses of Western Europe. Rommel, known for his keen understanding of mobility and mechanized warfare, realized that the best chance to stop an invasion was to crush it at the water's edge before the Allies could bring their full force ashore. He ordered miles of additional obstacles to be placed along the beaches and insisted that the coastline be littered with mines. So many that he claimed every 5 steps a mine. By his estimate, it would take 50 million mines to secure the French coast, though in reality, only about 6 million were laid due to shortages. Rommel also understood the importance of rapid counterattacks. He argued that Germany's armored divisions should be placed close to the coast, ready to strike the invaders immediately. However, his view clashed with that of other German commanders, particularly Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who believed the tanks should be held in reserve further inland, where they could launch a concentrated counteroffensive. This disagreement over strategy created confusion and delay, which would later prove costly on D-Day. For the soldiers who stormed Normandy, the Atlantic Wall was not just an abstract idea. It was a living nightmare. At Omaha Beach, where American forces landed, the defenses were especially dense. The high bluffs were lined with concrete bunkers containing 88mm guns, which could tear through both ships and infantry. Machine gun fire swept across the sand, while mortars and artillery rained down from hidden positions. The result was devastating. In the first hours of the assault, many American units suffered staggering casualties, with entire waves of men cut down before they could even reach cover. The Germans also made extensive use of the natural terrain. Normandy's hedgerows, fields divided by thick earthen embankments and dense vegetation, were turned into defensive strongholds. Once the Allies moved inland, German troops used the hedgerows as fortified positions, turning every field into a potential battlefield. Snipers, machine gunners, and hidden anti-tank guns transformed the countryside into a deadly maze. What appeared to be peaceful farmland became an extension of the Atlantic Wall itself. But the wall was not invincible. Despite its size and strength, it had weaknesses. Many of the bunkers were incomplete by June 1944, as resources had been diverted to other fronts. The German army, stretched thin by the war in the east against the Soviet Union, could not fully man the vast network of defenses. Furthermore, Allied air superiority meant that in the days leading up to D-Day, bombers relentlessly targeted coastal fortifications, softening them before the landings. Naval bombardments on the morning of June 6 further damaged many strong points, though not enough to neutralize them completely. The Atlantic Wall symbolized Hitler's belief in a fortress Europe, impenetrable and eternal. In his eyes, it was the ultimate deterrent a barrier that no army could break through. For the Allied soldiers who faced it, however, it was a gauntlet of terror and death. Yet it was also a challenge that had to be met head-on. Every bunker destroyed, every minefield cleared, and every obstacle overcome brought the Allies one step closer to victory. The Atlantic Wall was not just concrete and steel. It was also a psychological weapon. Its very existence was meant to intimidate and discourage. German propaganda boasted of its strength, portraying it as an unbreakable shield. But in reality, its effectiveness depended on the men who defended it, the decisions of their commanders, and the resolve of the attackers who were willing to face it. When historians speak of the D-Day landings, one name rises above the rest as a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and near impossible odds: Omaha Beach. While 5 beaches formed the backbone of the Allied assault, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, and Omaha, it was at Omaha that the invasion nearly faltered. On June 6, 1944, this stretch of French coastline became the site of some of the most brutal fighting of World War II. What unfolded on Omaha Beach was not only a test of military strength, but also of human willpower. Omaha was assigned primarily to American forces, specifically the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division, composed of both veterans and fresh recruits. They were supported by elements of the U.S. Army Rangers, elite soldiers who had trained for specialized assaults against fortified positions. Their mission was straightforward in theory but deadly in practice: storm the beach, break through German defenses, and secure the high ground that overlooked the shore. Without success at Omaha, the link between Utah to the west and the British and Canadian beaches to the east would be broken, jeopardizing the entire invasion. The geography of Omaha made it especially treacherous. Unlike some of the flatter beaches of Normandy, Omaha was flanked by steep bluffs rising up to 150 feet. These natural elevations provided perfect positions for German defenders to rain down fire on the exposed attackers below. The beach itself stretched nearly 6 miles and was covered with a deadly array of obstacles: steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes rigged with mines, barbed wire, and trenches. The rising tide threatened to trap landing craft against these barriers, while the open sand offered little cover for advancing troops. Defending Omaha were elements of the German 352nd Infantry Division, a hardened unit that had seen combat on the Eastern Front. These were not second-rate soldiers, as Allied planners had hoped, but experienced fighters equipped with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Their fortifications were part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall: concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and gun emplacements with fields of fire carefully overlapping to cover every inch of the beach. The Germans had spent months preparing for this day, and their defenses were designed to make Omaha a killing ground. At dawn on June 6, the assault began. Naval bombardments had struck the coastline earlier, but many of the German bunkers and gun positions survived largely intact. The first wave of American soldiers hit the shore around 6:30 a.m., and what greeted them was a nightmare. Machine guns opened fire as the landing ramps dropped, cutting down men before they could even step off the boats. Those who managed to disembark faced a sprint across open sand under withering fire, their only cover the smoke, the tide, and the bodies of fallen comrades. The chaos was overwhelming. Strong currents had carried many landing craft off course, scattering units and creating confusion. Tanks meant to provide fire support had either sunk in the rough seas or been destroyed almost immediately upon landing. Communications broke down as radios were soaked with seawater, leaving commanders with little knowledge of their men's whereabouts. In some sectors of Omaha, the first waves were virtually annihilated, with casualty rates exceeding 50%. Survivors found themselves pinned down behind obstacles, unable to advance but unwilling to retreat. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded, the deafening crack of machine guns, and concussions of mortar blasts. Some soldiers clawed their way through the sand with their hands, desperate for even a few inches of cover. Others dragged themselves behind beach obstacles, clinging to life while bullets snapped overhead. For hours, progress seemed impossible, and the risk of failure loomed larger with each passing minute. Despite the slaughter, pockets of determination began to emerge. Small groups of soldiers, often led not by officers but by sergeants or even privates, took the initiative. They crawled forward, used Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps in barbed wire, and hurled grenades into machine gun nests. Rangers scaled the cliffs at Point du Hoc, attacking the heavy artillery positions that threatened the landing zones. Engineers cleared mines under constant fire, creating narrow but vital paths off the beach. These acts of individual courage slowly began to turn the tide. By mid-morning, naval gunfire once again concentrated on the bluffs, hammering the German positions that had survived the earlier bombardments. Destroyers moved dangerously close to the shore, firing point-blank into enemy bunkers to provide relief for the trapped infantry. Meanwhile, airborne troops inland disrupted German reinforcements, ensuring that the defenders on Omaha had no additional support. Piece by piece, the grip of the Atlantic Wall began to weaken. The fighting on Omaha was not uniform. In some sectors, soldiers were still trapped in the sand well into the afternoon, but in others, breakthroughs began to occur. Exhausted, bloodied, and often reduced to fragments of their original units, American troops clawed their way up the bluffs. By sheer determination, they reached the high ground, assaulted enemy strong points, and forced German defenders into retreat. The cost was staggering, but the foothold was secured. Estimates of casualties on Omaha Beach vary, but most historians place the number at around 2,000 to 3,000 American dead, wounded, or missing on that single day. The sheer scale of loss earned Omaha the grim nickname Bloody Omaha, yet those who survived carried with them a story of unbreakable resolve. The struggle for Omaha Beach has since become one of the defining moments of the Second World War, not because it was a flawless operation, far from it, but because it demonstrated the capacity of ordinary soldiers to endure extraordinary hardship. The beach that morning was a crucible of fear, chaos, and suffering, but also of courage, sacrifice, and determination. Before the soldiers of the Allied forces set foot on the beaches of Normandy, before the paratroopers dropped in the night skies over occupied France, and before the world's largest amphibious assault unfolded, there was a different kind of battle. One fought with steel, fire, and thunder. This was the naval bombardment, the immense artillery barrage from the sea that served as the opening act of D-Day. It was not just a prelude. It was a critical part of the invasion plan, designed to weaken German defenses, sow confusion, and give the landing troops a fighting chance against the formidable Atlantic Wall. The Allied fleet assembled for D-Day was unprecedented in history. More than 7,000 ships and landing craft crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, supported by hundreds of smaller vessels. Among them were some of the most powerful warships of the time, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These ships carried massive naval guns capable of hurling shells the size of small cars from miles inland. The naval task forces were divided to support each of the 5 invasion beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each assigned with targets carefully chosen through months of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and aerial photography. At the heart of the naval bombardment strategy was the idea of neutralizing German strongpoints. The Germans had constructed bunkers, pillboxes, artillery positions, and fortified emplacements that overlooked the beaches. Many of these positions were reinforced with concrete several feet thick, resistant to most conventional attacks. The naval guns, however, offered the Allies a chance to crack open these defenses from afar. In theory, the bombardment would destroy, or at least disable the German guns, suppress machine gun nests, and create chaos in the ranks of the defenders. The bombardment began in the early hours of June 6. As dawn approached, the gray waters of the channel shook with the roar of heavy guns. Battleships like the USS Texas, USS Nevada, and the British HMS Warspite unleashed salvo after salvo. Each shot sent massive shells arching high into the sky, before crashing down on the coastline with earth-shattering force. The thunder of naval artillery was so intense that it could be heard for miles inland, a rolling drumbeat announcing the arrival of the invasion. The effect on the German defenders was immediate, though not always decisive. In some sectors, the bombardment inflicted significant damage, knocking out artillery batteries and reducing bunkers to rubble. At Sword and Gold beaches, the naval fire softened the resistance enough to allow infantry to advance relatively quickly once they landed. At Point du Hoc, U.S. Rangers scaled the cliffs under covering fire from destroyers, aiming to silence the German guns threatening Utah and Omaha. The naval gunners, despite firing from unstable platforms in choppy seas, provided crucial support for these daring assaults. Yet at Omaha Beach, where American troops faced the fiercest opposition, the bombardment fell short of its goals. Many of the German positions had been built deep into the bluffs, with reinforced concrete designed to withstand direct hits. Others were simply missed in the chaos of battle. Cloud, smoke, and the difficulty of precise targeting for miles offshore meant that many bunkers remained operational when the first waves of infantry landed. German machine guns and artillery roared back to life, cutting down soldiers on the beach despite the naval barrage that had preceded them. Still, the role of the naval bombardment cannot be measured only by what it destroyed. It also pinned down German forces, forcing them to take cover, disrupting communications, and creating psychological shock. For defenders, the experience of enduring hours of relentless shelling was terrifying. Even if their bunkers survived, the constant concussions shook their morale and limited their ability to coordinate. The bombardment also cut supply lines and damaged roads, making it harder for German reinforcements to reach the beaches in time to repel the invasion. As the day wore on, the bombardment shifted from pre-planned targets to direct fire support. Destroyers and cruisers moved dangerously close to shore, sometimes within a few hundred yards, firing directly into German strongpoints identified by soldiers on the beach. One of the most famous examples was the destroyer USS Satterlee, which supported the Rangers at Point du Hoc, firing continuously to keep German defenders pinned down as the Americans climbed the cliffs. At Omaha, ships like the USS Texas and USS Arkansas risked grounding themselves to get close enough to blast enemy positions that had survived the earlier bombardment. The coordination between sea and land was a challenge in itself. Communication had to be established between forward observers on the beach or in the air and the gunners aboard the ships. These observers directed fire onto German positions, sometimes calling in strikes just a few yards ahead of advancing infantry. Mistakes could be deadly, and in the chaos of D-Day, friendly fire incidents did occur. Yet overall, this coordination allowed the naval guns to act as giant, mobile artillery batteries, supporting the troops in real time as they fought their way off the sand. Another crucial role of the naval bombardment was counter-battery fire, the destruction of German artillery further inland. The Allies feared that heavy German guns could target the landing beaches and the Armada ships offshore. To prevent this, naval gunners focused not just on the immediate shoreline, but also on suspected artillery positions several miles inland. In some cases, these strikes succeeded in silencing dangerous batteries. In others, German guns continued to fire throughout the day, inflicting damage on landing craft and slowing the assault. The naval bombardment also included rocket-firing landing craft and smaller gunboats that delivered saturation fire on specific areas. These rockets, though less precise than heavy naval guns, created curtains of explosions designed to overwhelm defenders and clear paths to the infantry. The sheer variety of naval firepower, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, rocket craft, and gunboats, created a wall of noise and destruction that turned the Normandy coast into a storm of steel and fire. It is important to understand the scale of this operation. On D-Day, Allied warships fired tens of thousands of shells at German positions. Some ships expended nearly all of their ammunition during the course of the day, their barrels glowing red-hot from constant firing. The logistical effort required to keep these ships supplied with ammunition, fuel, and coordination with the landings was itself a feat of planning and execution. The naval bombardment of D-Day was one of the largest and most concentrated uses of naval gunfire in history. It was not perfect. Many targets survived, and many soldiers on the beaches paid the price for its limitations. But without it, the landings would have been far bloodier and perhaps impossible. When people recall D-Day, their minds often picture soldiers storming ashore under fire, paratroopers dropping to the night sky, and warships pounding the coastline. Yet, before the first soldiers set foot on the beaches of Normandy, another battle had already been fought. One without bullets or blood, but no less critical to the success of the invasion. This was the Battle of Deception, the secret war of trickery, misinformation, and illusion designed to mislead the German High Command. Known collectively as Operation Bodyguard, these deception operations played a decisive role in ensuring that the landings in Normandy were not immediately crushed. The stakes were immense. The Germans knew that the Allies would eventually attempt a cross-channel invasion. The only question was where and when. Hitler and his generals believed the invasion would be aimed at the northern French coast, but they did not know the exact location. For the Allies, keeping the element of surprise was essential. If the Germans concentrated their forces in Normandy before the landings, the invasion might collapse in a storm of firepower. Thus, deception was not merely helpful, it was vital. The heart of the deception plan was convincing the Germans that Normandy was not the primary target. Instead, the Allies sought to make the Germans believe that the real invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. This location made sense from a strategic perspective. It was the shortest crossing the Channel and offered a direct route into Germany. By reinforcing this belief, the Allies hoped to draw German troops and armor away from Normandy, ensuring that the defenses there would be weaker and slower to respond. One of the most elaborate parts of the deception was Operation Fortitude South. This operation created the illusion of an entire fake army, the first U.S. Army Group Fusag, supposedly stationed in southeast England across from Calais. In reality, Fusag did not exist. It was a phantom force, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, dummy landing craft, and even fake radio traffic. From the air, German reconnaissance planes saw what looked like massive military encampments, rows of vehicles, tent cities, and supply depots. German intelligence, piecing together reports, concluded that the Allies were preparing a major assault at Calais. To make the deception even more convincing, the Allies assigned one of their most famous generals to command this phantom force, General George S. Patton. The Germans respected and feared Patton, considering him the Allies' most aggressive and dangerous field commander. By placing him at the head of the fictitious army, the Allies reinforced the illusion that Calais was the true target. In reality, Patton was kept away from the actual Normandy planning, serving instead as a living decoy. Deception was not limited to fake armies and props. It also relied heavily on intelligence manipulation. The Allies had broken the German Enigma code, allowing them to monitor German communications. This gave them insight into what the Germans believed and allowed them to adjust their deception efforts accordingly. They also used double agents, most famously Juan Puto Garcia, codenamed Garbo, a Spanish double agent who had gained the trust of German intelligence. Garbo fed carefully crafted misinformation back to the Germans. He built an entire network of fictional sub-agents, providing reports about Allied troop movements, invasion timetables, and strategic intentions. His credibility with the Germans was so high that they accepted his reports as truth, even awarding him the Iron Cross. Through Garbo and other double agents, the Allies convinced the Germans that Normandy was only a diversion, a feint to draw attention away from the real invasion at Calais. Even after June 6th, when thousands of Allied troops were fighting in Normandy, Garbo's fabricated reports led the German high command to believe that the main force was still waiting to strike at Calais. As a result, Hitler held back critical armored divisions near Calais for weeks, believing that Normandy was merely a secondary attack. Another part of the deception was Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, both of which used radar spoofing and electronic warfare. On the night of June 5th to 6th, small boats and aircraft equipped with radar-reflecting strips known as window, or chaff, created the appearance of large fleets heading toward Calais. On German radar screens, it looked as if massive invasion armadas were moving across the channel toward the wrong beaches. While the real invasion force was headed for Normandy, German commanders hesitated, unsure of where to commit their reserves. The deception extended beyond Europe. In the Mediterranean, Operation Zeppelin suggested that the Allies might invade Greece or southern France. In Scandinavia, rumors hinted at possible landings in Norway. These diversions tied down German forces across a vast front, stretching their already limited resources thinner and preventing them from concentrating overwhelming power in Normandy. Every layer of deception built upon the others. Fake armies on the ground reinforced double agent reports. False radio chatter matched the movements of phantom units. Radar illusions created false fleets to match the intelligence the Germans thought they had gathered. By June 1944, the Germans were swimming in a sea of misinformation, unable to distinguish truth from fiction. The success of these operations was not guaranteed. If even one element had collapsed, if the Germans had discovered the inflatable tanks, if Garbo had been exposed, if their radar operators had grown suspicious, the entire deception might have unraveled. But the Allies executed the plan with such precision and attention to detail that the Germans remained convinced even after the real invasion began. The impact of deception on D-Day cannot be overstated. German commanders were reluctant to commit their reserves in Normandy because they feared a larger invasion at Calais. Hitler himself believed in the Calais theory so strongly that he refused to release panzer divisions that could have been decisive in counterattacking the Allies in the early days of the invasion. This hesitation gave the Allies the breathing space they needed to secure their beachheads and begin pushing inland. The invisible war of deception, fought in the shadows of espionage, illusion, and misinformation, was as crucial to victory as the tanks, planes, and ships that crossed the channel. Without it, the defenders of Normandy might have faced overwhelming reinforcements within hours, and the outcome of June 6 could have been very different. When history remembers D-Day, the images are often of soldiers charging across beaches, paratroopers dropping from the night sky, and ships unloading wave after wave of men and supplies. Yet behind that immense effort stood one man whose responsibility was greater than any other, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As the Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower bore the weight of the most ambitious military operation in history, Operation Overlord. His leadership was not only about strategy and planning. It was about diplomacy, unity, and the ability to make decisions that could alter the course of civilization. Eisenhower was not the obvious choice at the beginning of World War II. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, he was still a relatively unknown officer. He had never commanded troops in combat, and his career had been spent largely in staff roles, planning maneuvers and writing reports. Yet, his talent for organization, his calm temperament, and his ability to work with others quickly brought him to the attention of senior leaders. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, saw in Eisenhower a man who could rise above ego and nationality to forge cooperation among the Allies. That skill was critical because the Allied coalition was not a single army, but a patchwork of nations with different traditions, rivalries, and interests. The United States, Britain, Canada, Free France, and other nations all had forces preparing for the liberation of Europe. Bringing them together into one cohesive invasion force was no small task. Eisenhower's role was as much about politics as it was about war. He had to manage personalities like Britain's Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was brilliant but notoriously difficult, and American generals like George Patton, who was aggressive but often controversial. Eisenhower's steady hand kept the coalition intact, ensuring that disagreements did not derail the mission. His leadership style was marked by humility and a sense of shared purpose. Unlike some commanders who demanded absolute authority, Eisenhower often listened, sought consensus, and absorbed criticism without letting it fracture his resolve. In staff meetings, he encouraged debate, allowing his subordinates to voice differing opinions before he made the final decision. This approach built trust and loyalty among his officers, even when they disagreed with him. More importantly, it allowed the Allies to function as a unified force, a necessity for an operation as complex as D-Day. The planning for Operation Overlord took months and involved some of the most intricate coordination ever attempted in warfare. Eisenhower oversaw not only the military strategy but also the logistics of moving men, ships, planes, weapons, and supplies across the English Channel. He had to balance the advice of his naval commanders, who worried about weather and tides, his air commanders, who demanded clear skies for bombing and paratrooper drops, and his ground commanders, who pressed for as much firepower as possible to smash through the German defenses. At the same time, Eisenhower kept one eye on the political landscape, ensuring that both Roosevelt and Churchill remained confident in the mission. Perhaps one of the defining moments of Eisenhower's leadership came in the days leading up to June 6, 1944. The invasion depended heavily on weather conditions. The English Channel is notoriously unpredictable, and the tides, winds, and cloud cover all had to align for the assault to succeed. On June 5th, storms battered the channel, making a landing impossible. Eisenhower's meteorologists predicted a brief window of improved weather on June 6, but it was a gamble. Postponing the invasion for too long risked exposing the entire plan, while launching under poor conditions could spell disaster for the thousands of troops involved. On the night of June 4th, Eisenhower gathered his commanders in a tense meeting. Arguments filled the room, Some favored delay. Others urged action. The weight of the decision fell on Eisenhower's shoulders. If he gave the order to proceed and the invasion failed, it would cost the Allies not just lives, but potentially the entire war in Europe. If he delayed too long, German intelligence might discover the plan. After hours of discussion, Eisenhower quietly but firmly made the call. "Okay, let's go." Those 3 words set in motion the liberation of Western Europe. Eisenhower also understood the human dimension of leadership. On the eve of the invasion, he visited paratrooper units who were preparing to board planes for the dangerous drops behind German lines. Walking among them in the rain, he shook hands, spoke to individual soldiers, and offered words of encouragement. Photographs from that night show Eisenhower with the men of the 101st Airborne Division, smiling and relaxed, though inside he carried the crushing weight of responsibility. That visit boosted morale and left a lasting impression on the troops, who felt that their commander cared for them not as numbers on a map, but as individuals. Privately, Eisenhower prepared for the worst. In his pocket, he carried a handwritten note that he drafted on June 5th. It was a statement accepting full blame in the event the invasion failed. The note read in part, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He was ready to take sole responsibility for the lives of the men under his command, a mark of both his humility and his courage. The note was never needed, but its existence revealed the depth of his character. During the invasion itself, Eisenhower refrained from micromanaging. Once the decision had been made and the operation launched, he allowed his commanders to execute their roles without interference. He understood that success required trust in his subordinates, and that the scale of the operation was too vast for one-man control in detail. His ability to delegate authority, while keeping the larger vision in mind, was one of his greatest strengths. Eisenhower's leadership was not simply about military decisions. He was also a symbol of Allied cooperation. In an alliance that often strained under the weight of national interests, he served as a neutral figure, respected by Americans, Britons, and Canadians alike. His even temper, lack of arrogance, and diplomatic skill allowed him to bridge gaps that might otherwise have fractured the coalition. For Roosevelt and Churchill, he was not only a general but a diplomat in uniform, someone who could balance the pride of national leaders with the practical needs of the battlefield. Even after the landings began, Eisenhower continued to face immense pressures. Reports of heavy casualties at Omaha Beach reached him early on June 6. For hours, it seemed that the landings might fail entirely. Yet Eisenhower remained calm, confident that the determination of the troops and the weight of Allied resources would eventually carry the day. His steadiness in those moments helped prevent panic from spreading through the command structure. The burden Eisenhower carried was unlike that of any other commander in history. He was not just responsible for a single army or battlefield, but for an entire coalition effort involving millions of men across multiple nations. Every decision he made carried consequences that rippled across the world. His success or failure would determine whether Europe would remain under Nazi domination or be freed. The Normandy Landings were not only the largest seaborne invasion in history, but also one of the costliest single-day battles for the Allied forces during World War II. Behind the triumph of June 6, 1944, lies a sobering truth. Approximately 10,000 Allied troops became casualties in just 24 hours, with more than 4,000 confirmed dead. These numbers represent not statistics on a page, but individual stories of sacrifice, courage, and human cost. To understand the invasion fully, one must confront the scale and nature of the losses that defined D-Day. The landings were divided across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each with its own challenges and levels of resistance. Casualties varied depending on geography, defenses, and sheer luck. Some troops faced only light fire and advanced inland quickly. Others met walls of steel, machine gun nests, and artillery that seemed to turn the shore into a death trap. Nowhere was the suffering more acute than at Omaha Beach, where American forces bore the brunt of German firepower. The geography of Omaha worked against the attackers. Steep cliffs, narrow exits, and heavily fortified bunkers overlooking the sand gave German defenders near total dominance. As the first waves of soldiers waded ashore, many were cut down before reaching cover. Landing craft were riddled with bullets and shells. Men drowned in the surf under the weight of their gear. Those who survived the crossing often found themselves trapped with little more than shattered remnants of units and broken equipment. Estimates suggest that out of roughly 34,000 men who landed at Omaha on D-Day, nearly 2,400 became casualties by the end of the day. At Utah Beach, also stormed by American forces, casualties were significantly lighter, around 200 to 300 men. A fortunate current had carried the landing craft slightly south of the plan zone, putting troops ashore in an area where German defenses were weaker. The difference in losses between Utah and Omaha highlights how chance, geography, and defensive strength shape survival rates. For the British and Canadian troops landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, the experience was varied. At Gold Beach, British forces faced determined resistance, but naval bombardments had weakened German defenses. Casualties numbered around 1,000 men, significant but not crippling. At Sword Beach, where the British sought to link up with airborne forces inland, casualties were estimated at about 700. Juno Beach, assaulted by Canadian forces, proved deadly in its opening moments. The first wave suffered nearly 50% losses as they faced underwater obstacles, mined beaches, and fortified positions. Casualties at Juno totaled around 1,200 men by the end of the day. For Canadians, Juno was both a moment of tragedy and triumph. They endured fierce losses, but also penetrated farther inland than any other landing force on D-Day. Beyond the beaches, casualties mounted among the airborne divisions. In the hours before dawn, over 24,000 paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, as well as the British 6th Airborne, dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission was to secure bridges, disrupt German reinforcements, and create chaos ahead of the main landings. The night jump was chaotic. Poor weather, heavy anti-aircraft fire, and navigational errors scattered units across the countryside. Some paratroopers drowned in flooded fields. Others were killed before even firing a shot. Many who landed alone or far from their units were hunted down by German patrols. Casualties among the airborne forces on June 6 are estimated to have been around 2,500 men. The air forces also paid their price. Allied bombers and fighter aircraft flew thousands of sorties on D-Day, attacking coastal defenses, road networks, and supply lines. While their overwhelming presence dominated the skies, losses were still felt. More than 100 Allied aircraft were shot down on June 6, costing the lives of hundreds of aircrew. Naval forces, too, were not spared. While the majority of ships remained offshore, German coastal batteries and mines took their toll. Several landing craft were sunk before reaching shore, and support ships sustained damage. The U.S. destroyer USS Corey was sunk by a mine off Utah Beach, costing the lives of over 20 crewmen. Dozens of sailors lost their lives in similar tragedies, showing that even those who never set foot on the beaches were not beyond danger. Casualties were not uniform in nature. They included men who were killed instantly by machine gun fire, artillery shells, or mines, men who drowned in the surf, and others who were gravely wounded and later succumbed. Medical teams worked frantically to save lives, often setting up makeshift aid stations right on the beaches under fire. The wounded outnumbered the dead, and their suffering was immense. Soldiers with shattered limbs, severe burns, and traumatic injuries endured agonizing waits for evacuation as medics and stretcher-bearers raced against time. Among the casualties were also countless acts of bravery. At Omaha, medics like Charles Normandy, a Native American combat medic, ran into open fire to drag wounded men to safety. Chaplains prayed over the dying amid the chaos. Engineers sacrificed themselves to clear mines and obstacles so that others could land. For many, survival was owed to the courage of those who risked everything to pull comrades from danger. The toll of casualties extended beyond soldiers. French civilians in Normandy also paid a heavy price. Allied bombardments and naval shelling targeted German positions, but inevitably destroyed villages, farms, and towns. On D-Day alone, thousands of French civilians were killed or wounded as their homeland became a battlefield. For them, liberation came with devastating loss. The psychological impact to casualties was as severe as the physical. Soldiers who survived often carried lifelong scars, both visible and invisible. Witnessing the deaths of friends, comrades, and even commanding officers left deep trauma. Units were torn apart, sometimes reduced to fractions of their strength within hours. Yet, despite the losses, men continued to advance, driven by duty, leadership, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. Historians emphasize that while 10,000 casualties in a single day is staggering, it was far less than what some commanders had feared. Pre-invasion estimates warned of as many as 20,000 to 30,000 Allied dead in the first 24 hours. The combination of surprise, overwhelming naval and air support, and sheer determination kept the toll from becoming catastrophic. Still, for the families waiting at home, each casualty was an irreplaceable loss. Letters were written, telegrams delivered, and communities across Allied nations were struck by grief in the days that followed. The figure of 4,000 dead on D-Day itself has become iconic, but it represents only part of the human cost. Thousands more were maimed or permanently disabled, their lives forever altered. Entire neighborhoods in Britain, Canada, and the United States had young men who never returned. Normandy cemeteries today, with their rows upon rows of white crosses and stars of David, stand as a testament to those who gave their lives on that single day. The casualties of D-Day remind us that victory came at a price paid in blood. Each number in the tally conceals a story of a soldier, sailor, or airman who left behind a family, dreams, and a future that would never be fulfilled. When we think of D-Day, the images that most often come to mind are of soldiers storming ashore, aircraft roaring overhead, and warships pounding the coastline. Yet, beyond the soldiers in the battlefield, there was another group deeply affected by the invasion, the civilians of Normandy. For them, June 6, 1944, was not a single day of liberation, but a day of terror, upheaval, and immense suffering. While Allied forces advanced with the goal of freeing France from Nazi occupation, thousands of Frenchmen, women, and children paid the price with their lives, their homes, and their futures. The Normandy region had endured 4 years of German occupation before the landings. Towns and villages were under strict control, resources were scarce, and the local population lived under the constant shadow of fear, forced labor, and repression. When rumors spread that an Allied invasion was imminent, many Normans hoped for liberation, but also dreaded what it might bring. They knew their homeland would become a battlefield. For them, freedom was never going to arrive quietly. It would arrive amid fire and blood. As Allied bombers and naval ships prepared the battlefield, entire communities were caught in the crossfire. In the days leading up to D-Day, the Allies launched an intense bombing campaign designed to disrupt German communications, destroy bridges, railways, and supply depots, and weaken coastal defenses. These attacks struck military targets, but they also devastated civilian areas. Cities such as Caen, Saint-Lô, and Cherbourg were reduced to rubble. Thousands of French civilians were killed in their homes before the invasion even began, victims of the very bombs meant to ensure the success of liberation. On June 6 itself, the destruction escalated. Naval artillery opened fire on the coastline to soften German defenses for the landings. The shelling was relentless, turning strong points in villages near the beaches into smoking ruins. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated. For civilians trapped in these areas, there was no escape. Families huddled in basements or barns, praying the shells would not fall directly on them. Some were killed instantly by collapsing walls, shrapnel, or fire. In towns near the beaches, such as Ouistreham, Courseulles, and Vierzon-sur-Mer, civilians awoke to an apocalypse. The sea seemed alive with ships, the sky roared with planes, and the ground shook with explosions. For many, it was impossible to distinguish between the attackers and the defenders. Bullets ripped through homes, gardens, and farms as Allied troops exchanged fire with German garrisons. Civilians who had survived 4 years of occupation suddenly found themselves in the middle of the largest battle of the war. The civilian death toll on D-Day alone is estimated at around 3,000 people, though precise numbers are difficult to confirm. These were ordinary villagers and townsfolk, farmers and shopkeepers, children and the elderly. Their deaths were as much a part of the invasion as the casualties suffered by soldiers on the beaches. And unlike the soldiers, they had no weapons, no training, and no protection. They were caught helplessly in the storm of war. Those who survived the first day often found themselves displaced. Homes were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and fields burned. Families fled into the countryside, carrying whatever they could salvage. Some sought refuge with relatives in neighboring villages, while others hid in forests, caves, or even among the ruins of their own homes. The roads of Normandy became rivers of refugees, their carts and bicycles piled high with belongings as the battle raged around them. The ordeal did not end with D-Day itself. The battle for Normandy stretched on for weeks. Towns like it became battlegrounds where entire civilian populations suffered. Caen, targeted by heavy bombing on June 6th and again in the following weeks, was virtually destroyed. More than 75% of the city was reduced to rubble. Families were buried alive in their shelters. Entire streets were flattened, and survivors were left wandering through a wasteland of stone and fire. St. Lo, another historic town, was so devastated that it was later described as the capital of ruins. For the people of Normandy, the destruction was total, physical, emotional, and cultural. Centuries-old churches, schools, libraries, and farms were obliterated in the fighting. Generations of history vanished in hours under the weight of shells and bombs. The landscape itself bore scars that would take decades to heal. Fields pockmarked with craters, hedgerows torn apart, bridges collapsed, and entire villages erased from maps. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological toll was immense. Civilians endured not only the fear of bombs and bullets, but also the uncertainty of survival. Many lost loved ones, children who wandered too close to the fighting, parents crushed in collapsing houses, siblings caught in crossfire. Survivors were often haunted by the trauma of what they had witnessed. The sound of tanks rolling past their homes, the screams of the wounded, the sight of burning towns lighting up the night sky. And yet, amid the devastation, many civilians actively supported the Allies. Some provided shelter to paratroopers or guided soldiers to the complex hedgerow country. Others sabotaged German positions, cut telephone lines, or passed along intelligence. Acts of courage came at a high cost. Civilians caught helping the Allies were often executed by German forces, who viewed local populations with suspicion. Liberation was therefore not only a matter of enduring bombardment, but of taking extraordinary risks in the face of occupation. The displacement of civilians was staggering. Tens of thousands were left homeless, forced into refugee camps set up behind Allied lines. In these camps, families lived in tents or makeshift shelters, relying on ration food and medical care from Allied units. Disease spread quickly, and hunger gnawed at the displaced. For many, the joy of liberation was tempered by the loss of everything they had once known. Children, in particular, were deeply affected. Many lost parents or siblings, and their childhoods ended in the chaos of war. Schools were destroyed, playgrounds became ruins, and the only lessons they learned came from the horrors of survival. For a generation of Norman children, D-Day was not a heroic tale, but memory of fear, hunger, and grief. The suffering of civilians also left moral dilemmas for the Allies. Commanders knew that their bombardments would kill innocents, yet they argued that destroying German defenses was essential to save the invasion. For soldiers storming the beaches, the sight of civilian casualties was heartbreaking but unavoidable. The paradox of D-Day was that liberation came wrapped in destruction. The very forces freeing Normandy were also responsible for much of its ruin. By the summer of 1944, World War II had raged for nearly 5 years, engulfing entire continents and reshaping the global order. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, had once seemed unstoppable, their armies sweeping across Europe, Asia, and Africa with terrifying speed. Yet by 1944, the tide of war had already begun to turn. The Soviet Union had pushed the Germans back from Moscow and Stalingrad, North Africa had been liberated, and Italy had fallen to the Allies. Still, Adolf Hitler's Germany remained unbroken in Western Europe. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands remained under Nazi occupation, and the Atlantic Wall, the vast network of fortifications running along the coast, stood as a symbol of German strength. It was in this context that D-Day became the true turning point of the war in Europe, for it represented not only a massive military operation, but the long-awaited opening of a Western front. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was more than a battle. It was a political, military, and psychological shift that fundamentally altered the balance of the war. The idea of a second front had been debated for years. As early as 1942, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had demanded that the United States and Britain open a front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. At that time, Germany's war machine was focused largely on the Eastern Front, where millions of soldiers clashed across vast territories in battles of unimaginable scale. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting, losing millions of men and women in its struggle for survival. Stalin argued that only a direct invasion of Western Europe would force Hitler to divide his armies and shorten the war. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, hesitated. The Allies were not yet ready in 1942 or even 1943. Britain's army was still recovering from years of defeat and evacuation. The United States was only beginning to mobilize its immense industrial power, and the logistical challenge of crossing the English Channel under enemy fire was staggering. Instead, the Allies chose to fight first in North Africa, then in Sicily and Italy. Campaigns that provided experience and drained German resources, but did not satisfy Stalin's demand for a Western front. Thus, by the time Operation Overlord, the code name for the Normandy invasion, was launched in June 1944, anticipation had reached its peak. For Stalin, it was a long-promised relief he had demanded for years. For Churchill and Roosevelt, it was a decisive step to prove that Anglo-American forces could liberate Europe directly. For Hitler, it was the nightmare he had always feared, a two-front war that would stretch his armies to the breaking point. The Western Front opened with thunder. On June 6, 1944, nearly 156,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, supported by over 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and its success immediately forced Germany into a defensive posture it could never fully recover from. Within days, the Allies had established a secure beachhead. Within weeks, tens of thousands of reinforcements had crossed the channel, bringing tanks, artillery, and supplies. For the German High Command, the invasion was catastrophic. Hitler had long feared that the Allies would strike somewhere along the French coast, but he believed that the most likely site was Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To reinforce this belief, Allied deception operations, most notably Operation Fortitude, convinced the Germans that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the real invasion was still to come at Calais. As a result, German reserves were held back, waiting for an attack that never came. This delay allowed the Allies to secure Normandy and expand their front before Germany could mount an effective counterattack. The opening of the Western Front also forced Hitler to make impossible choices. Until June 1944, the majority of German forces had been concentrated in the East, locked in brutal combat with the Soviets. Now, with the Allies advancing from the West, Hitler had to split his forces. Divisions that could have been used to defend against the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, were instead diverted to France. The consequences were devastating. While the Germans struggled to contain the Allies in Normandy, the Red Army launched one of the largest offensives in history, destroying Army Group Center and driving deep into Eastern Europe. Germany, once the master of Blitzkrieg, was now being crushed from both directions. The Western Front was not just a geographical line. It was a political statement. Its very existence demonstrated the unity of the Allies. American, British, Canadian, Polish, and Free French forces fought side by side in Normandy, showing the world that liberation was not the work of one nation, but of a coalition determined to defeat tyranny. This unity was vital in sustaining morale both at home and abroad. In occupied countries, news of the landing spread quickly, igniting hope among resistance movements that had endured years of oppression. For the French resistance, D-Day was a signal to rise up and sabotage German communications, railroads, and supply lines, actions that further weakened the German defense. The psychological effect of the Western Front cannot be overstated. For the German people, who had been told for years that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, the success of the Allied landings was a devastating blow. The myth of German invincibility crumbled overnight. For the Allies, the landings were proof that victory in Europe was within reach. Soldiers who had trained for years finally saw that their efforts were leading to tangible progress. Civilians in Britain and America followed the invasion with a mixture of anxiety and elation, recognizing that the liberation of Europe had truly begun. The scale of the Western Front was immense. Within 3 months of D-Day, the Allies had liberated Paris, pushed through northern France, and begun advancing toward Belgium. Supply lines stretched across the Channel in an extraordinary feat of logistics, with artificial harbors known as mulberries allowing ships to unload supplies directly onto the beaches. Pipelines laid under the Channel, codenamed Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, carried fuel to support the advancing armies. Every detail of the invasion showcased the overwhelming industrial and organizational strength of the Allies, a strength Germany could no longer match. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Western Front was its inevitability. Once the Allies had established themselves in Normandy, Germany faced a war it could not win. The Reich was trapped between two advancing giants, the United States and Britain in the west, the Soviet Union in the east. Every day that passed drained German resources further. Every battle weakened their armies, and every retreat brought the Allies closer to the heart of Germany. What had once been Hitler's empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, was collapsing. The Normandy Landings of June 6, 1944, known forever as D-Day, were not simply a military operation. They were a statement. An event that transcended the immediate objectives of seizing a beachhead or liberating a country. The invasion carved its place into history as a lasting emblem of Allied unity, courage, and determination against tyranny. The legacy of D-Day has endured for generations because it was more than a single day of combat. It was a moment when nations, divided by geography and political traditions, forged a common purpose to fight for freedom. The success of D-Day was built on years of careful preparation, trust, and cooperation between allies who often held very different views. The United States, Britain, and Canada provided the majority of the troops, but other nations, France, Poland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, and more, also contributed forces, resources, and intelligence. This broad coalition was unprecedented in scale. Unlike the Axis, which was dominated by Germany, the Allied coalition was decentralized and diverse. It represented democratic governments, exiled leaders, and armies in exile, each with their own culture and motivations, but unified by one shared goal: the destruction of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Europe. This unity was far from automatic. The Allies had disagreements over strategy, leadership, and priorities. Britain, with its centuries-old empire, often looked to protect its colonial and Mediterranean interests. The United States, a rising power, pressed for direct assaults in Western Europe to hasten the war's end. The Soviet Union, bleeding millions of lives on the Eastern Front, demanded that the Western Allies relieve pressure by striking Germany from the West as soon as possible. Negotiating these tensions required extraordinary diplomacy. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin clashed in conferences from Tehran to Yalta, but the final decision to launch Operation Overlord symbolized a moment when cooperation triumphed over division. The leadership of D-Day reflected the spirit of unity. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, an American, was appointed Supreme Allied Commander. His deputies included British commanders like General Bernard Montgomery and Admiral Bertram Ramsay, alongside Canadian generals and Free French leaders. Eisenhower's ability to balance these personalities and national priorities was essential to maintaining harmony within the coalition. His headquarters became a microcosm of the Allied effort. Multilingual, multinational, and collaborative, orders were translated. Strategies debated across accents and cultures, but the common cause held them together. The soldiers on the beaches were themselves symbols of unity. Americans stormed Utah and Omaha. Canadians took Juno. The British advanced on Gold and Sword, and French commandos joined them to reclaim their homeland. Each beachhead was a patchwork of accents, uniforms, and flags, yet together they moved as one force. The paratroopers who dropped into Normandy represented the same unity. American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne landed alongside British airborne divisions, their missions intertwining in the darkness to disrupt German defenses. Even the skies above reflected this unity, as aircraft painted with invasion stripes carried men from across the Allied world. The determination displayed on D-Day became another defining aspect of its legacy. The operation was fraught with obstacles: poor weather, rough seas, and fierce German defenses. Yet the soldiers pressed forward. At Omaha Beach, Where American forces faced catastrophic losses, the spirit of determination was most evident. Small groups of men, leaderless and scattered, refused to give up. They crawled through sand and seawater, scaled cliffs under gunfire, and overcame what seemed like an impenetrable defense. Their courage demonstrated that determination, not just planning, was a deciding factor in battle. For the nations occupied by Nazi rule, D-Day symbolized a return of hope. Resistance fighters in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had endured years of repression, sabotage, and executions. News of the Allied landing spread like wildfire across occupied Europe. To the French resistance, it was a signal that liberation was not just a dream, but a reality within reach. They launched attacks on German supply lines, ambushed convoys, and disrupted railways, showing their determination to join the fight. The legacy of unity extended beyond the battlefield. It connected soldiers in uniform with civilians risking their lives behind enemy lines. D-Day's symbolic power was also shaped by the sacrifices made. The cost was high. Thousands of Allied soldiers lost their lives on the beaches, in the skies, and in the hedgerows of Normandy. Each grave became a testament to the unity of nations willing to pay the ultimate price for a shared cause. Cemeteries in Normandy today hold crosses and stars of David for Americans, Canadians, Britons, and others resting side by side in foreign soil. They embody a legacy of determination that future generations continue to honor. The propaganda value of D-Day reinforced its legacy during the war itself. Allied leaders seized upon the invasion as proof of their unity and strength. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines. Radio broadcasts carried news of the landings, and governments declared that the liberation of Europe had begun. For civilians enduring rationing, air raids, and years of uncertainty, D-Day became a moment of pride and reassurance. It was evidence that their sacrifices on the home front, factories working around the clock, women joining the workforce, families sending loved ones overseas, were bearing fruit. The global reach of D-Day's legacy extended far beyond Europe. In North America, families followed the landings with personal investment, knowing their sons, brothers, and husbands were part of it. In Canada, a smaller nation that contributed disproportionately to the war effort, the landings at Juno Beach became a symbol of national pride. In Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth nations, the invasion reaffirmed the idea that freedom in Europe was linked to the security of the wider world. Even in colonies under European control, the message of unity and determination resonated, planting seeds of future independence movements. D-Day also reshaped the post-war world order. The unity forged on the beaches of Normandy laid the groundwork for institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan. Though the Cold War would soon divide East and West, the spirit of D-Day served as a reminder that democracies could unite to confront a common threat. The shared determination of 1944 became a reference point for later struggles against tyranny, whether in Korea, Vietnam, or during the long standoff with the Soviet Union. In cultural memory, the legacy of D-Day has been preserved through books, films, monuments, and ceremonies. From famous photographs of soldiers wading ashore to Steven Spielberg's cinematic recreation in Saving Private Ryan, the image of D-Day has become synonymous with courage and sacrifice. Ceremonies at Normandy each June bring together veterans, world leaders, and younger generations to reflect on what was achieved. Each commemoration reinforces the idea that D-Day was not merely a battle, but a universal lesson about unity in the face of adversity. The D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, marked not just a singular moment of triumph, but the beginning of a chain of events that reshaped the trajectory of World War II. Its historical importance cannot be measured solely by the success of the landings on the beaches of Normandy. Instead, it lies in how this operation directly set in motion the liberation of Paris, the collapse of Nazi control in Western Europe, and the eventual defeat of Germany in 1945. When Allied forces established a foothold in Normandy, they achieved more than a tactical victory. They created the foundation for a strategic breakthrough across the continent. The invasion broke through Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall, which had been constructed with the belief that it was impregnable. For years, Nazi propaganda had boasted that any Allied attempt to land on the western coast would be crushed instantly. Yet, the breach at Normandy proved otherwise. By securing the beaches and rapidly building supply chains, Through innovations such as the mulberry harbors and the undersea Pluto pipelines, the Allies ensured that their presence in France would not be temporary. They had returned to stay, and with that return came the unraveling of Nazi domination in Western Europe. The next major stage after Normandy was the breakout into the French countryside, a phase that demonstrated both the ferocity of German resistance and the unstoppable momentum of the Allied advance. The Battle of the Hedgerows, fought throughout June and July 1944, illustrated the challenge of moving through Normandy's dense bocage terrain. German panzer divisions, equipped with formidable tanks and artillery, turned every hedgerow into a fortress. Casualties were heavy, but Allied determination, combined with overwhelming material superiority, gradually wore down German defenses. Operations like Cobra, launched in late July, finally broke the stalemate and opened a path towards central France. This breakthrough carried immense historical significance. For the first time since 1940, Allied armies were moving freely across the French countryside. German forces began a hasty and chaotic retreat, leaving behind destroyed equipment, abandoned vehicles, and shattered morale. The fall of cities such as Caen, Saint-Lô, and eventually Rennes revealed that the German grip on France was collapsing. What had once seemed like an unshakable occupation began to disintegrate under the weight of Allied pressure and the resilience of local resistance movements. It was within this context that the liberation of Paris emerged as one of the most iconic moments of World War II. Paris had been under Nazi control since June 1940, a symbol of humiliation for France and a prize jewel in Hitler's empire. By August 1944, however, the city had become restless. The French resistance, emboldened by Allied successes, staged uprisings and strikes, eager to reclaim their capital before it was destroyed. Adolf Hitler, furious at the prospect of losing Paris, reportedly ordered that the city be reduced to rubble rather than allowed to fall into Allied hands. His infamous command, "Paris must not fall into hands of the enemy, or if it does, only as a field of ruins," reflected the desperation of a regime facing inevitable defeat. Yet the determination of the Parisians and the speed of the Allied advance thwarted this plan. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, insisted that French troops must be the first to enter Paris, to symbolize the restoration of French sovereignty. On August 25, 1944, Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, supported by American units, entered the city to the sound of church bells and jubilant crowds. The liberation of Paris was not just a military victory. It was a political and psychological triumph. The sight of the tricolor flying once again over the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe demonstrated that Nazi domination in Western Europe was collapsing. It also ensured that France, battered but unbroken, would rejoin the ranks of liberated nations shaping the post-war world. The liberation of Paris set the stage for an even broader Allied push across Europe. By September 1944, Allied forces had crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands, liberating Brussels and Antwerp. Each city freed brought logistical advantages and boosted morale, not only for the soldiers but also for civilians across occupied Europe. German forces, now retreating on both the eastern and western fronts, faced an impossible struggle. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, destroying entire German armies and advancing toward Poland. With the Allies pushing from the west and the Soviets from the east, the once expansive German Reich was being squeezed into a shrinking corridor of territory. The winter of 1944-45 saw one last desperate gamble by Hitler. The Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, German forces launched a surprise counterattack through Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. Initially, the offensive shocked the Allies, creating a bulge in their front lines. But the resilience of American forces at places like Bastogne, combined with the rapid regrouping of British and Canadian divisions, halted the German advance. By January 1945, the offensive had failed, leaving Germany weakened and unable to mount another large-scale counterattack. The failure of this operation marked the end of Germany's ability to dictate the pace of the war. From January onward, the Allies advanced inexorably toward Germany itself. Crossing the Rhine River, they penetrated deep into the industrial heartland of the Reich. Cities such as Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg fell one after another. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union stormed across Eastern Europe, liberating Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna, before finally setting its sights on Berlin. The two fronts, East and West, were converging, closing the trap on Hitler's crumbling empire. The fall of Germany in May 1945 was a direct consequence of the chain reaction unleashed by D-Day. Without the Western Front, the Soviet Union would have continued to bear the overwhelming burden of fighting the Wehrmacht. Without Normandy, there would have been no liberation of Paris, no return of French sovereignty, and no symbolic reclaiming of Western Europe from Nazi rule. The presence of Anglo-American forces on the continent ensured that Germany was crushed not by one enemy alone, but by a united coalition, a fact that shaped the political map of post-war Europe. The defeat of Nazi Germany was not merely the removal of a military power. It was a collapse of an ideology that had brought unprecedented destruction. The Holocaust, the systematic extermination of millions, was uncovered in its full horror as Allied armies liberated concentration camps. Towns and villages across Europe, long under occupation, experienced freedom again for the first time in years. The historical importance of D-Day thus stretched far beyond military lines. It was a catalyst for the restoration of democracy, the redrawing of borders, and the creation of a new international order. The Normandy Landings were more than a military triumph. They were a turning point in history. D-Day showed the world that courage can overcome fear, that unity can defeat tyranny, and that determination can shape the destiny of nations. The sacrifices of June 6, 1944 were immense, but they paved the way for the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany less than a year later. Today, as we look back, D-Day remains not just a date in history books, but a reminder of what people can achieve when they stand together against oppression. It is a legacy of bravery, of sacrifice, and of hope. A legacy that continues to inspire generations who live in the freedom those soldiers fought and died to secure.